Bring that seat right here. Watch your step. Once you get in there, make yourself comfortable. Do me one favor, grab the microphone, speak directly into it. And once you've got all that, you're comfortable. If you would say your full name for the record, please.
My name is Anne Marie Brown. And Ms. Brown, what do you do for a living? I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And what is your work? I'm a director for a children's trauma program, and I also run a private practice. And how about your education background? I have a bachelor's degree in social work, a master's degree in social work. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, a master's level certified addiction professional, a certified intervention professional, an internationally certified alcohol and drug counselor, and I am TFCBT and F3S certified.
And do me a favor, slow down a little bit. Madam Court Reporter is going to yell at me. All right, go ahead.
In terms of your sort of day-to-day work, do you work with clients?
I do.
And what types of clients?
I specialize in working with children who have experienced significant abuse and neglect, primarily sexual abuse, attachment disorders. I assess children who have entered the child welfare system, and I make recommendations, and I attend court on their behalf.
And I'm just going to show you, okay, Defense Exhibit 25. Is this a much more detailed report about your work, your experience, all of that?
Yes, it is.
Rather than us going through it, I will admit to have its defense exhibit.
Any objection?
No.
Admitted.
So, Ms. Brown, have you been present in court the last 2 days?
Yes, I have.
And so you have listened to the testimony with regards to Christopher Vasata's upbringing, background, family, challenges, all of that?
Yes.
And have you also conducted some collateral interviews?
Yes.
And do you know who you actually spoke with in person?
In person, I spoke with Mr. Vasata.
Okay, no, I meant interviews.
Interviews, I spoke with his stepfather, and I spoke with several individuals who had been caretakers and involved with his biological mother. I also spoke with an individual who was a family friend.
And in terms of the information gathered outside of what has it all basically been presented in this courtroom to these jurors in the last 2 days?
Yes.
So I want to just kind of jump right in and ask you, of the sort of information you have, what as a social worker and one who works with people who have had trauma or abuse or neglect, what is it that is significant to you in Christopher's life that has impacted his emotional, mental, and moral development?
Some of the things that stuck out to me include attachment issues, significant history of abandonment and loss, exposure to domestic violence, exposure to parental substance abuse or caregiver substance abuse, normalized criminal behavior, normalized substance use. One of the things that really stuck out with regard to the domestic violence was in reviewing the domestic violence reports. I read through 6 reports that began potentially when Christopher was in the womb, spanning all the way until he was 5 years old. What is significant about that is that based on studies and research, we know that when children are exposed to domestic violence within that time frame, prenatally all the way through the age of 5, it negatively impacts their ability to function, it negatively impacts their brain development, it impacts their attachment, leading to a lot of issues later in life.
And what is significant, we of course, heard a lot of testimony with regards to the different sort of caretakers in his life, the loss of people who loved him, the instability in that setting. what is significant about that? How does that impact somebody's development?
So having multiple caregivers, lacking that consistency is going to lead to difficulty with attachment. Biological mother did not appear able to meet his emotional needs. Then there were multiple caregivers in and out of his life. He starts to build relationships, and then those people leave. That could potentially reinforce cognitive distortions of I'm not good enough, I'm unlovable, I'm unwanted, I caused this to happen. But more significantly, it's going to increase his difficulty with attachment. And attachment is really the backbone of child development. If children don't have a secure attachment with their primary caregivers, or the people who are responsible for taking care of them on a daily basis, they're not going to develop properly.
And is that emotionally?
Emotionally, physically, psychologically, all of the above.
Is there research to support it can even affect the development of the brain, the physical development of the brain?
Absolutely. Research has shown that children who have insecure or disorganized attachments, they have smaller brain sizes, and their brains also, there are neural connections that need to happen, do not happen.
And what about maturation, sort of the normal maturation, both sort of emotionally, socially, those kinds of things?
So an attachment disorder would inhibit that, and a child would lack the ability to regulate their emotions. They're going to have poor coping skills, poor impulse control, and general difficulty functioning. That being said, they may have the body of an older teenager or even a young adult, but they lack the brain functioning that matches.
And in terms of, to the attachment disorder, when we say that, you say difficulty making healthy attachments.
Yes.
Does it ever cause sort of unhealthy dependence or attachments?
Absolutely, because a child who has an insecure or a disorganized attachment may be looking to fulfill that need that was never fulfilled. So they're going to bond with whomever will be there for them, whomever will take them under their wing, whomever will care for them, because that's what they're seeking.
And as we see children who have been subjected to that, as they get into adulthood, is there an impact on relationships?
Of course.
Does it play any role in sort of the desire for approval or dependence on others or those types of things?
Absolutely. One would always be seeking approval from others. One would always be looking to fulfill that unmet need from early childhood.
You've heard, a fair amount about Christopher actually being sort of a generous person who would do things for others.
Yes.
Does that have a connection to this?
Yes, it does, because he's approval seeking, it's attention seeking, not in a negative way, but he's seeking to meet those needs, always wanting to have that approval, that love, knowing that people are going to be there for him.
Even if his own needs are going unmet?
Absolutely.
With regards to the exposure to domestic violence, how does that impact a person? And of course we can talk about children, but I really want to talk about the exposure in childhood, but how does that impact an adult with regards to their own feeling of safety or perception of danger?
So to talk about that, I do need to start in childhood because that's where it originates. When young children, especially prenatally to the age of 5, when they experience domestic violence, when their primary caregiver is unsafe, they require that caregiver to survive. So when their caregiver is involved in a domestic violence relationship, the child is going to automatically feel unsafe because the caregiver's survival is threatened. So when that happens and when you have a situation where potentially toxic stress has occurred, that initiates an increase in the stress hormones in the brain. which then leads to potentially a fight, flight, or freeze response, which in a toxic stress environment, which is multiple instances of domestic violence, that negatively impacts the brain, and it can change the brain chemistry, so that someone who has experienced that in early childhood is going to grow up with that fight, flight, or freeze response system, which means that a child who has experienced the toxic stress, as an adult, they're going to live in that stress reaction, and they're going to either consistently fight, consistently run away, or they're going to be unresponsive.
So let's talk for a minute about toxic stress. We, of course, use the word stress in our day-to-day lives all the time. What is different about toxic stress?
So toxic stress occurs when there are significant traumatic events that a child experiences in the absence of buffers. Buffers are people in the child's life who are there consistently to remind them that you are safe, you are loved, you can get through this. Toxic stress occurs when there are significant instances of neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, attachment traumas. And it's different from tolerable stress or positive stress, because with tolerable stress, we have buffers and there's people around us. An example of tolerable stress would be planning for a wedding. It's fun, it's exciting, but it's stressful, and there are people around you who are going to support you. Toxic stress is just what I said. It's that experience of caregivers in and out of your life, exposure to domestic violence, all of those different things.
And you mentioned about physical or sexual abuse, and of course that doesn't seem to have been an issue in this case. Is that something that is worse than attachment issues and abandonment and loss issues?
Attachment issues are really quite significant and more severe, because attachment comes down to the basic safety of a child. If an infant does not have the ability in those first 3 months to 3 years to attach securely to their caregiver, they're going to struggle significantly for the rest of their lives.
Now, we've heard, of course, that Christopher did have attachments early. It's just they would get cut off and move to another and move to another.
Yes.
What is the effect of that on his emotional, mental, and moral?
Lacking that consistency is really difficult for a child. It's why the child welfare system places children in one stable home when they're removed, because children thrive and they are able to heal when they have a secure, consistent caregiver. So not having that negatively impacts a child's development on all levels.
And what about the impact of, you had mentioned exposure to substance abuse, and of course we've heard about some exposure to substance abuse in the home. What is the impact on Christopher?
There's a few different impacts. I would say number one, it's the normalization of a behavior that is not good or it's not healthy. The other issue is that caregivers who have substance use disorders, they're not stable, they're chaotic, they're not consistent, it's neglectful. And so that leads to a child's basic needs not being met potentially.
And what about, I think you had mentioned normalized criminality.
Yes.
And of course we have heard testimony with regards to Christopher's exposure to a parent that was involved in criminal activity. What is the impact of that on his moral development?
So Christopher would have learned that it was an acceptable way of living, it was an acceptable career, these are acceptable behaviors to engage in. At some point later in life, in adolescence, that becomes, as people become more exposed to the outside world, to peers, they start to question their caregivers, and they start to develop their own sense of what's right and what's wrong. However, when a child is exposed to that at such a young age, it becomes ingrained and normalized and typified, and not necessarily their go-to behavior, but in terms of seeking approval from their caregivers, if they're able to gain that approval, they'll engage in that behavior.
You mentioned about sort of the significance of events for very young children. Is there another period of a person's growth that is particularly significant?
There's a second window of opportunity to help a child in early adolescence.
And that's what?
It depends, usually about 11 to 13.
Back to the issue with regards to this fight, flight, or freeze. Does that have any sort of bearing on a person's perception of danger?
It does. Any individual who has experienced that toxic stress and who lives in that fight, flight, or freeze response system is going to respond that way. So they're going to perceive threats and danger where there may not be threats and danger. They're going to feel unsafe when perhaps they are safe, but they lack that basic sense of safety and what that means.
And this can go with a child through adulthood.
Yes.
The other question I have with regards to this is how do any of these issues play into maybe susceptibility to drug addiction?
Well, a child is going to be more susceptible to drug use. An adolescent, an adult is going to be more susceptible to drug use because, number one, they lack that basic impulse control, and they're constantly seeking to fill that void that's left from having an insecure or a disorganized attachment. And so drugs fit that bill quite neatly.
What about issues like anxiety, depression?
So children who experience difficulty with attachment, they're 2 times more likely to experience anxiety, and they're 3 times more likely to experience depression.
We've heard testimony about Christopher through most of his life doing this hair pulling. Is that something that is significant with regards to his emotional and mental health?
It is. It's a self-harming behavior that's related to an anxiety disorder.
And does it have to do with kind of emotional pain?
Of course.
How so?
When an individual is in significant emotional distress, the body does a number of things to self-soothe. A lot of those begin as healthy skills or skills that are effective for them in that moment, such as hair pulling or even dissociation. Over time, they become unhealthy and maladaptive, and they start leading to problems. So young children will always find a way to cope with their stressors or their traumatic experiences, and when they find something that works, they continue that.
And so that, from what you have heard in this courtroom and what your interview showed, that sort of compulsion of Christopher's to pull his hair, what do you believe that is evidence of?
Anxiety, stress, trauma.
What about a person's sense of self and pride? Does that impact its self-esteem by these factors?
Yes. A person's sense of pride, self-esteem, those are developed in early childhood. Our biological caregivers or our caregivers, they reinforce those. So if we have caregivers who are there for us, consistently saying, you're good enough, you're worthwhile, you're succeeding, I'm proud of you, good job, that leads to a healthy sense of self, positive self-esteem. If we don't have caregivers, or if we have caregivers who are absent, or caregivers who are sporadic, inconsistent, in and out, we don't consistently have that, and when those caregivers leave, we often question ourselves and what did I do to cause this to happen?
And are sort of the things you said earlier about the need for approval, is that somewhat indicative of issues about self-worth and self-esteem?
Yes. every human has the need for approval. Oftentimes, it can stem back to that initial early attachment with a caregiver. If we don't have that from our caregiver, we're always going to have that. We're always going to have that unmet need, and we're going to seek it out in other places. So Christopher may have continued to seek that out with his biological mother, with his stepfather, with the women that he dated, with friends, just constantly seeking that approval, that I'm good enough, I'm lovable, I'm worthy.
And given the things that you have heard that are sort of many of the significant events in Christopher's life, does it surprise you that he did develop a substance abuse problem?
Not at all.
So, some of the things that you've talked about that impact, how a person may be impacted, impulse control, sort of the ability to really, think well about consequences. Is that an emotional response, or is that, sort of brain impairment, or is it all of it?
It's all of the above. The ability to make rational decisions, to have better impulse control, and to have good judgment. It's emotional, but those are all controlled by the brain. So if the brain is not developed properly, or if the brain is smaller because of childhood adversity, then it's going to impact those things later in life. If a child has not learned those in early childhood, they're going to struggle later in life.
Now, we've heard Christopher had some, very good people and some healthy attachments and some good role models. So why does that not compensate for the negative experiences?
Because they were inconsistent, and they were pulled from his life. So to start with, he had his biological mother, and there was domestic violence, which already significantly impacts the child. And then over the next 18 years of his life, there are people who are in and out of his life. And yes, they are good role models, and yes, they left a mark, and they helped him. But at the same time, when those caregivers were pulled from his life and he was not allowed to have contact with them anymore, that negatively impacted him. And for a child, children don't have the ability to understand why people leave. And so often they internalize it, and it becomes about them. What did I do to cause this? How did I make it happen? Children have a sense of magical thinking where they're responsible for things that happen and events. And so if a child does not understand why people left, they're going to internalize that and blame that on themselves.
Certainly we hear of people who have suffered lots of very traumatic events or deprivation who go on to be very successful. What is sort of the name of that?
Buffers. Buffers and consistency. So buffers are people who are there in our lives, who are stable, who are safe, who are healthy, who teach us good things, who are positive role models, but they need to be there consistently for them to have a greater impact.
So the buffer for 2 years, or a buffer for 3 years, a different buffer for 3 years, is not going to fill that.
It makes an impact, and he's there, he's able to remember that positive impact, but the traumatic event of them being pulled away with the sudden contact, with the suddenness cut off, is going to play a greater role.
I just want to talk for a minute about sort of Christopher's strengths, his emotional and mental strengths. Did you see any?
I did.
And what are they?
He's very loyal. He seems to be there for his friends. The people in his family seem to be giving of himself with his friends and family and those around him, there to help as needed.
And did you find any severe mental illness that makes him incapable of, living a normal life?
No.
You did spend a little bit of time with Christopher.
I did.
Did you find that Christopher sort of relies on some of the hardships he has suffered in his life as an excuse for his behavior, or as a sort of crutch to explain things he has done wrong?
No.
Almost the opposite.
Yes, so Christopher didn't really want to talk about childhood experiences or difficulty that he had encountered. He didn't really feel comfortable talking about traumas, which is understandable, no one does. But he also really talked about how he loved his family, and his family was very important to him, and he didn't want to see the negative side.
So he's not sort of playing the role of, it's not my fault, this is why I'm the way I am,
No.
it's other people's fault.
No.
Now, in terms of sort of your evaluation, having heard the testimony and your discussion about how these various things have impacted Christopher, is any of this sort of an excuse for criminal behavior or a justification for criminal behavior?
No, not at all.
Does it just help us understand Christopher today?
Yes, it does.
His behaviors in the past?
Yes.
Thank you.
Any questions?
No, thank you.
You may step down, ma'am. Thank you very much. Pass. Rebecca Vasata, please. Mrs. Vasata, good morning. Come out to the middle, raise your right hand, face your report for us.
We solemnly swear from the evidence you are about to give to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
All right, you're going to have a seat right up there. Watch your step. Make yourself comfortable. Please speak directly into the microphone. And state your full name.
Rebecca Vasata.
And your seat.
I am 23.
And the relationship with his son.
My big brother.
I understand that you were the youngest of your mother's children. And your father is,
Wang Young.
are you the one child that lived?
Yes.
Were they together when you were born?
I don't believe so. I think I was told that they had split right before.
Are you the fifth?
Yes, I am.
Can you tell us about where you're from?
Right now, I currently work for a boat tour company out of the marina that I was working at before I got pregnant. Fort Pierce City Marina.
You said that you got pregnant.
Yes.
And was that your first pregnancy?
Yes. A girl, my daughter.
And how old is your daughter?
She is just about to turn 16 months.
We've heard a lot of testimony about how you and your siblings moved around a lot.
Yes.
And that the adults in your life were changing very frequently.
Yes.
There was a time when you and your siblings were split up, correct?
Yes.
Do you remember how old you were?
I was in elementary school. For a second time.
And how much younger are you than?
4 years, I believe.
And when you guys got split up, did you both go to your dad's house?
Yeah, me and Chris went to the
So it seems like for Christopher, the sibling he lived with most consistently would be you.
Yes.
So tell us about the relationship that you had with your brother.
We had a great one. We would ride bikes. He would walk me to school. We would play basketball with our friends down the street. He always watched over me when we played video games. I would sneak into his room in the middle of the night. I remember one Halloween, we snuck out of his room while my dad was asleep and got candy out of the kitchen, brought it back to his room and stuffed our wrappers behind the bed. We got caught by the trailer ants that found their way behind his bed.
Was it protected?
Very,
I had heard a story about him walking to elementary.
yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the elementary school that I went to is directly diagonal across from the neighborhood that we lived in. And there was a park and a large concrete wall behind that park. And he would take me there every morning and help boost me up the tree and over the wall before he would climb himself over and walk me across the street.
He's 4 years older. What about when he went to, well, actually, yeah, sorry. Any other, were you particularly close?
Yeah.
How do you feel about your brother today?
I love him just as much as I love him since I was born.
What are some qualities about Christopher that you're able to
He's loving, he's compassionate, he's caring, he's protective. He's my only big brother. He's the best thing in my life.
Do you want to stay in his life after he goes to prison?
Of course, I would never abandon him.
What about with your daughter? What kind of relationship do you want?
I want my daughter to know him. I want her to know the same Nathan that I know. I want her to know the Chris that I grew up with, and I want her to be able to have him and know the great person that he is and the kind person that he is and help me. I need his help to raise her and to make her a good person.
Even if he is in prison?
Yes, yes, no matter where.
Any questions? Okay, you may sit down. Watch your step. Thank you. And defense? Okay, Juan Jr.? Yes? And you're ready? Juan, come on up, sir. Good morning. Watch your step. If you do me a favor, raise your right hand, face this gentleman.
Do you solemnly swear upon the evidence you are about to give the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
All right, you're going to have a seat right up there. Watch your step. And once you get yourself situated, you look like you're pretty tall. Make sure you get that microphone pointed up. You're perfect. Tell us your full name.
Juan, third.
And Juan, maybe we're going to pull that base a little bit toward you. The whole bottom of it. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, Ms. Howitt, you may proceed.
Look at your own. Thank you. Juan, how old are you?
I'm 15 years old.
And what is your relationship?
Oh, very shy.
Is he your brother?
Yes.
Now, when I met you, I wasn't planning on justifying it. I was your age. You wanted to.
Yes, it's correct.
Why did you want to?
I feel like I'm the most closest person to him, and like, it's just, I feel like I can make a difference.
You wanted to tell the story, what he has meant to you?
Yes, my brother, he is a role model to me, and I feel like I wouldn't be the person I am today if it wasn't for him. And he's teaching me more about economics, financial, and later on in life, how I can be successful.
So I'm going to just talk to you a little bit about that first in terms of things he has done for you.
Well, things he's done for me, well, he's always been there for me. When there was days when I would just sit down and nothing to do, he would call me, say, oh, what are you doing? I'm bored. I come pick you up. maybe go do something, grab something to eat, and just come back happy to have left.
So this would be when you're at home and Christopher wasn't living with you.
Correct.
He was living in Jupiter, and you were living in West Palm. Okay. And so he would just call you and say, everything okay?
Yeah, let's check up on me, make sure I was okay, make sure the family was okay, everything was good.
Did he drive down and take you somewhere?
All that way, just drive down just to see.
What about help you with things you needed? Any kinds of things that you needed?
Well, therapy days after school would just come pick me up, and we would just go sit under a park and just do my homework. And there would be times where I just don't want to do it, and he said, you gotta do it.
So he helped kind of encourage you.
Yeah.
With your school. And what do you mean about business? What was...
Well, he teach me about investments and how more like owning businesses can make you more successful in life.
He wanted you to have a successful future.
Yes.
A legitimate future. So, one, you know that the best that can happen is that your brother spends the rest of his life in prison.
I've realized that.
What can he do for you?
Well, even if that was to happen, I would still feel like a phone call could still change my life. Just like a few words from him telling me, keep your head up, or do this, make sure you stay in school, or you're still working on whatever investments, or just don't forget what I taught you.
I feel like that would be important to you and help you grow up healthy.
Correct.
Anything else you want to tell the jury?
Nothing really.
You love your brother.
Yeah.
And you know that he loves you?
Yes.
And has that helped you through your life?
Very.
I don't know.
Any questions? You may step down, sir. Thank you. Watch your step. Anything further, defense?
Yes, sir.
The defense rests. We are done with the presentation of evidence. So what we're going to do to keep this thing kind of compact is take a lunch break now. When you come back, we have the jury instructions all done. Packets are ready for you. The verdict form. They'll be waiting on your chairs for you when you return from lunch. And I'm going to give the attorneys a chance to get their thoughts together. Each side gets to give a closing. And then you'll start deliberating this afternoon. So I'm going to ask you to gather up at the usual place at 1:15. Well, let's make it 1:10. Got enough time for everybody to do what they need to do? I appreciate your hard work. We'll say 1:10. 1:10. Turn your pads upside down. Still do not talk about the case. Don't Google, Facebook, or Twitter. And I'll see you back at 1:10. So, lawyers, state, I didn't really nail you down. Who's going to do the first part? And you go first? Defense goes first.
No, I was pointing to Mr. Trump.
Okay.
Just one.
Just one. Okay. So, how long do you need, state? And you asked for an hour.
Yeah.
Okay. Say 40 minutes. Give her a 5-minute warning so you know you're coming down the home stretch. Give both sides, and we'll see what happens. So, 1:10, I'll see you guys back, and hopefully we go right into the charge, and we'll go from there.